All right, welcome to a new chapter in Ecclesiastes. I believe there's 12 chapters, and we've gone through 8, so we're well over the halfway point in our study. And last week, at the conclusion of chapter 8, and thinking about chapter 8, we were talking about the difficulties of life. And there's a lot of wisdom, a lot of things to meditate on this book. And again, we're seeing Solomon now in his old age. He's doing a lot of reflecting. He's been a king. He's lived a very full life. But he's meditating. He's thinking. He's passing his wisdom on. I've entitled, we're going to do about half this chapter. I've entitled today The Two Parts of Life. So we've been dealing with lots of things related to life. But I'm going to talk about two parts of life. Maybe I'll ask you to even think about what I'm referring to there. What are the two parts of life? Of course, I'm just giving you my opinion, but I'll share some thoughts on that. So, I'll start off here in verse 1 of our new chapter. So, thinking of all that he's already gone through, and remember, he's been through a lot. He first dealt with the crisis of life being vanity, being a vapor, passing away quick. He thought about his power, his riches, his everything, and he had to come to terms with that. And in the last few chapters, he's been saying, well, now in light of that, how should we live? But he goes on and says here, but all this I laid to heart, examining it all. Remember, he's like a scientist. He's dissecting. He's studying. He's a wise man. But he says, and how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. Now, this is true for every person. I like this, in the hands of God. Remember that old childhood song? He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the red and the yellow and the black and the white, and they're all in his hands. The truth of the matter in that song, there is truth. A lot of our songs we may have learned as children, they may sound simple, but there's deep spiritual truths. We are in his hands. We're all in his hands. We are in his providence. We are in his care. We are, on one hand, he's the hands that have molded us and given us life, but it's also to him of whom we must give an account. So whether it's love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. It's all before him. And it's the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As the good one is, so is the sinner, and he who swears is as he who shuns an oath. Now, we're talking here about the first part of life. And if you're hearing my voice, if you're watching this video, if you're thinking, then you're in the first part of life. That is the life in this vapor. The life, this vain life, this temporary part that we have. For some, it's the same. It's not exactly the same. And there are people who die at younger years, and there are people that die in older years. The provision we're given in this life can vary. But overall, the big picture, micro things may change, but in the macro, we're all the same. And it was the same for Solomon as it is for us as well. We're in this first part of life. And he says, this is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that the same event happens to all. I'm just restating that fact. And the hearts of the children of men are full of evil, and madness is in their hearts while they live. And after that, they go to the dead. And that's true for all, too. And yes, there are micro variations in our madness. And there are micro variations in our evil. But we have all committed sinful acts. And we all go to the dead. But look, this part is so important. But he who is joined with all the living has hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. And they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Their love and their hate and their envy have already perished, and forever they have no more share in all that is done under the sun. That sounds a little depressing. But the reality is, there is a part one. There is a life in this earth, but it comes to an end. And there will be a part two. But as long as you're in part one, as long as you are joined with the living, whether your age today is a person of teenage years or younger, whether you're in the middle of life or whether you're towards the end, you are joined with the living, if you can hear that. And in that there is hope. There is hope to make choices and to make decisions. There is still time because you are still in part one. And that's of crucial importance. Now, in part one, there's some wisdom he gives us. In this part of life, we are to eat our bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart. For God has approved of what you do were in his hands. Let your garments be always white. Let not oil be lacking on your head. If you can eat your bread, eat it with joy. He has given us this day our daily bread. In Acts 2:46, it says, thinking of the early church and day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts. There's something about giving thanks for our daily bread, our provision, to be merry, to be thankful, to have joy that we're still amongst the living, that we're still have this opportunity of life. This idea of your garments being white is an idea of purity, to be unspotted, to let not oil be lacking on your head. Think of Psalm 23:5. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows, a sign of blessing. And Jesus himself even allowed his head to be anointed with oil. There should not be a depression in this stage of life. We should be sober-minded, knowing it's temporary, but there should also be joy. The idea here is even in our everyday activities. We eat our bread with joy. We try to keep our garments unspotted. We receive a blessing of God and oil upon our head. He also tells us about the blessing of family. He says, enjoy life with the wife whom you love. And God also, besides giving us provision of bread, gives us provision of family. He gives us parents and children and siblings and husbands and wives. This is part of what he's given us since the beginning. And it's what we have. It's a portion we have. And we do also, even from Adam, we were created to work and to give toil unto the sun. And there's wisdom in enjoying our family, our food, our provision, the blessing of the oil on our head, and whatever your hand finds to do it with your might. For there's no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. Now, thinking about the part 2, which is looming. But while it's today, and while you're joined with the living in John 9:4, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, because night is coming, and no one can work. So, as we think about these two parts, in part 1, it's temporary. But in part 1, there should be joy. There should be a sober-mindedness that this is not the end, but with whatever we've been given, we should receive it. And we also realize that we have a stewardship with the time we've given and a responsibility, because part 2 is coming. And the choices and the decisions we make in part 1 are paramount to part 2. And so that's what I want to refer to as we get to the second part. He keeps telling us, it's coming. We go back here. It says, and they go to the dead. The same event happens to all. The time comes when there is no work or thought or knowledge to where we are going. And so while we have this wisdom to soak up the joy of part 1 of our life, there's a sober-mindedness that part 2 will come. And for that, I'm going to take this to a passage from Luke chapter 16 that Jesus taught us. And he says, there was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and he feasted sumptuously every day. In part 1, he was living the good life. His dress was good. His wealth was good. His food was sumptuous. It was good. But there was another man, and at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus. And in part one of his life it was not so good. He was covered with sores. He desired to be fed with just whatever fell off the table. He was ready to eat some crumbs. And even the dogs came and licked his sores. Quite a contrast in the part one of their life. But, as we're told in Ecclesiastes, the same event happens to all. The poor man died. He was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. And the rich man also died and was buried. They both had the same event occur, as it happened to Solomon, as it happened to them, as it will happen to us. And in Hades, being in torment, the rich man lifted up his eyes, and he saw Abraham far off, and Lazarus at his side. He called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and sent Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. His part one was over. His part two had a different outcome. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things. There was a point he was joined to the living, but there was a point he was cut off. Lazarus had bad things, but now he's comforted, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed. We have a blessing in part one, that there is time, but there is a part two where it is fixed. And the books are closed. And it's over. And what's been said and what's been done has been done. In order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. And he said, Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so he may warn them, lest they also come to this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they won't repent. But he said, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, and by the way, even Ecclesiastes, which we have before us, and the Gospels, which we're reading now, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. There's advice here for the 2 parts of life. We're all together in part one. We all have different kinds of food to eat, but we should receive them with joy. We have family. We have the blessings of God to live. And it's a blessing because we have hope. Now, part 2 will come. And there's a warning here. It was given then and it's given to us today. Will we hear Moses? Will we hear the prophets? Will we hear the Gospels? Will we hear one, Jesus, who has risen from the dead to share the good news? Enjoy your life today. Enjoy part 1. But this is just a vapor. It's just the beginning. Part 2 is right around the corner. And once it is fixed, it is fixed. But for today there is hope. Hear from the one that is risen from the dead. Turn to him. Repent. Receive him. And be ready not just for part 1, but for the part 2 of life.